Welcome to a podcast by opentheword.org, where we discuss a bit of Bible, a bit of life, and a bit of politics.
Hi, my name is Dean Smith, and in this podcast, I want to discuss an issue that has puzzled many people, namely, why don't we find any mention of the devastating 10 plagues or Israel's departure in Egypt's archaeological records? Though Egyptian pharaohs were notorious for downplaying their defeats and glorifying their victories, you would think there would be at least some hint of Israel's exodus. Well, in fact, there is a reference to the plagues, but it hasn't caught most Christians' attention because it requires a major rethink of when the Exodus took place, because it puts the Exodus about 300 years earlier than traditionally believed. And as an added bonus, in this podcast, I will reveal who I think was the actual pharaoh of the Exodus. If you watched any of the movies about Israel's exodus out of Egypt, they always portray the pharaoh as a, bald-headed Ramses II, arguably one of Egypt's most powerful and famous pharaohs, who ruled between 1279 and 1213 BC. There is a reason for this, because in the biblical account, we find 4 references to Ramesses, but in each instance, the name is used to describe a city or territory and not the actual name of the pharaoh. That is important because cities, regions, and even countries can change their name over time, particularly when there's a new government in power. Turkey changed Constantinople's name to Istanbul. The Soviet Union was renamed Russia. And we even see the same thing occurring in Genesis chapter 47, verse 11, that reads, "So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramesses, as Pharaoh directed." Even though the actual Exodus would not take place for another few hundred years, we are told that the Hebrews were settling in the district called Ramesses, the name of the Egyptian pharaoh that most people consider to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. A few verses later, it is referred to by its original name, the land of Goshen. Though this seems like a discrepancy, it isn't. As these ancient manuscripts were meticulously rewritten by hand down through the centuries, at times the scribes would use current names that people were familiar with to describe an area. And this paves the way for an ancient papyrus on display at the Dutch National Museum of Antiquities located in Leiden, Holland. Called the Ipuwer Papyrus, it was discovered in 1828, but wasn't translated until 1909, when Professor Ellen Gardner discovered it was a lament, speaking of a very chaotic time in Egypt's history. It spoke of disasters, deaths, mysterious natural phenomena, and famine. It was written by a man named Ipuwer, who may have actually witnessed the events he was describing as he mixes historical with current events. The Ipuwer Papyrus is dated to the New Kingdom period of Egypt that started around 1550 BC. In the papyrus, Ipuwer also referred to a group called the Asiatics, and most believe this is a reference to an unusual time in Egypt's history when the Hyksos, a Semitic people similar to the Jews, conquered the northern half of Egypt in the 17th century BC, driving the Egyptian government into the southern half of the Nile Delta. But there is evidence the Hyksos arrived about 150 years earlier before they were finally strong enough to take over northern Egypt in what was essentially a bloodless coup. When the Hyksos took over, they simply assumed the Egyptian government, as the Hyksos leaders even adopted the title of pharaoh. They even embraced some of the Egyptian culture, as archaeologists have found sphinxes with the names of Hyksos pharaohs carved on them. Around 1550 BC, the Egyptians were finally able to drive the Hyksos out of northern Egypt and retake the full Nile Delta. In his papyrus, Ipuwer was referring to the period shortly after the Egyptians regained control of the northern part of the Nile Delta and was warning the Egyptian pharaohs that if they did not deal with the people honestly, Egypt would be judged by their gods as they had been several years earlier. And then Ipuwer goes on to describe some of these judgments that are eerily similar to several of the plagues mentioned in the book of Exodus. In the following comparison of the Ipuwer plagues with the biblical plagues, I used a translation provided by Rabbi Mordecai Becker of OHR Somiak, a Jewish seminary. First, we see a reference to the first plague found in Exodus chapter 7, verse 20, when God turned the water of the Nile River into blood. It was undrinkable, and the Egyptians were forced to dig wells in order to find fresh water. The Ipuwer Papyrus reads, "The river is blood. Men shrink from tasting, human beings, and thirst after water." Ipuwer 2, verse 10. Secondly, we also have a reference to the fifth plague mentioned in Exodus chapter 9, verse 3, when God struck the cattle and all the animals of Egypt with a plague. Ipuwer Papyrus reads, "All the animals, their hearts weep, cattle moan." Ipuwer 5, verse 5. Thirdly, the Ipuwer Papyrus also discusses the sixth plague when God judged the Egyptians with festering boils that broke out into open wounds. It not only struck people, but animals as well. Exodus 9, verses 8 to 9. The Ipuwer Papyrus reads, "Plague is throughout the land, blood is everywhere." Ipuwer 2, verses 5 to 6. Fourthly, there's also a reference to the seventh plague when God sent a massive hailstorm that destroyed the herbs and flax and barley crops which were close to harvest. Exodus chapter 9, verses 24 to 25 and verses 31 to 32. Ipuwer Papyrus speaks of a crop failure that affected the Egyptian revenues. It reads, "Lower Egypt weeps, the entire palace is without its revenue. To it belongs wheat and barley, geese and fish." Ipuwer 10, verses 3 to 6. "Forsooth, grain has perished on every side." Ipuwer 6, verse 3. Ipuwer 5, verse 12 also compares the weariness of the land to the cutting of the flax that would happen when a massive hailstorm hits. In connection with the seventh plague, the Bible mentions a massive storm that resulted in lightning that rolled along the ground. Fire was mixed with hail. Exodus chapter 9, verses 23 to 24. The Ipuwer Papyrus also speaks of damage to fire. It reads, "Forsooth, gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire." Ipuwer 2, verse 10. Fifthly, the Ipuwer Papyrus also mentions the ninth plague found in Exodus chapter 10, 22, where it says that a great darkness covered the land for 3 days. The Ipuwer Papyrus reads, "The land is without light." Ipuwer 9, verse 11. And finally, there's also a mention of the last plague, the death of the firstborn, when God sent a death angel to kill the firstborn of every family, including the pharaohs. Exodus chapter 12, verses 29 to 30. The Bible adds that a great cry was heard across Egypt. Ipuwer Papyrus also refers to this plague, describing it this way: "He who places his brother in the ground is everywhere." Ipuwer 2, verse 13. "It is groaning through the land, mingled with lamentations." Ipuwer 3, verse 14. "Forsooth, the children of the princes are dashed against the wall." Ipuwer 4, verse 3. "Forsooth, the children of princes are cast in the streets." Ipuwer 6, verse 12. But the similarity does not stop there. The Ipuwer Papyrus also referred to a couple of other unusual events connected with Israel's exodus out of Egypt. Ipuwer talks about a massive transfer of wealth from the Egyptians to the slaves of society, writing, "Gold and lapis, lazuli, silver, malachite, carnelian, and bronze are fastened on the necks of female slaves." Ipuwer 3, verse 12. What would happen to cause such a strange thing to take place? We know from the biblical account that towards the end of their stay in Egypt, the Pharaoh was treating the Hebrews as slaves. But a strange thing happens after the Pharaoh finally allowed Israel to leave after the deaths of the firstborn. We read in Exodus chapter 12, verses 35 to 36, that as they were about to leave, the Hebrews asked the Egyptians for gold and silver. Call it payback for their years of slavery. Having just gone through the judgment of the plagues, it's obvious by this point the Egyptians were terrified of the Israelis. According to Ipuwer, much of it showed up in the form of jewelry as they poured out of their homes, handing over their wealth. But there is another reference in the papyrus that addresses a second event unique to this time. As Israel was leaving, the Bible says that God led them by a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night, Exodus 13, verse 21. The Ipuwer Papyrus also refers to a fire high in the sky, but puts a bit of a political spin on it, stating that they believed the Egyptian gods were pouring their wrath down, a fire down on the enemies. At least that's what was stated in the official release by the pharaoh's press office. Ipuwer writes, "Behold, the fire has mounted on high. Its burning goes forth against the enemies of the land." Ipuwer 7, verse 1. So despite these distinct similarities between the biblical plagues and what is mentioned in the Ipuwer Papyrus, we have to address the bigger issue. Is there any evidence in the Bible to support this earlier date for the Exodus? I believe there is. If the Ipuwer Papyrus suggests that the plagues of Egypt took place 300 years earlier, shortly after the Hyksos were driven out of northern Egypt, then this also means that Joseph arrived in Egypt while the Hyksos were in control of the northern Egypt. As a fellow Semite, Joseph would have had a similar language and culture to the Hyksos, and this explains why, with God's help, he so easily rose up to second in command in Egypt. It also explains why the Hyksos welcomed Joseph's extended family to settle in some of the prime land in Egypt. But this also explains two other puzzling passages related to the Exodus story. The first is found in Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 to 5. After Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers to a band of passing Ishmaelites, they immediately headed off to Egypt and sold Joseph to Potiphar, the head of security for the Pharaoh. But in the 5 verses describing the sale, a very strange thing happens. We are told 3 times that Potiphar was an Egyptian. He is described as the Egyptian officer of the Pharaoh in verse 1. In verse 2, Potiphar is described as Joseph's Egyptian master. Verse 5 also describes Potiphar's house as the Egyptian's home. So what is strange about that, you ask? Well, it is this. In the matter of 5 verses, Moses specifically tells us 3 times that Potiphar was an Egyptian, when he didn't even have to mention it once. We would just have naturally presumed that he was. And equally bizarre, Moses specifically described Potiphar as the Egyptian officer of the Pharaoh. It's like me saying, did you know the President of the United States is American? Then a few seconds later, jabbing you in the ribs and telling you again he is an American, and then 2 seconds later mentioning that he even owns a house in the United States. If I did that, you would think I was a bit off my rocker, because of course everyone knows he's an American. But this is essentially what Moses did. So why did Moses do this? Because of the obvious focus on Potiphar's Egyptian heritage, we have to conclude that the fact he was Egyptian was very strange, and Moses emphasized it several times to make this point. And the only time this would be unusual is if Potiphar, the Egyptian, was serving as head of security during the reign of the Hyksos pharaohs. And as strange as that sounds, using local people as head of security during a time of occupation is not all that unusual. When the Germans invaded France during World War II, they only had 7,500 German administrators and military in the country, and used the French police and militia to maintain their control of France. And having French police serving in this way would be useful because they were familiar, number one, with the French language and also the culture. Then finally, in the first chapter of Exodus leading up to Israel's exodus from Egypt, we find another interesting passage. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, we read, "Now a new king rose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Exodus 1, verse 8. Why is this Pharaoh described as a new king? During the previous years, there would have been undoubtedly several different Hyksos pharaohs. But there was something different about this one, and we are told what it is. This Pharaoh did not know Joseph or the Hebrews living in the land. I believe this verse is describing the arrival of the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose, who drove the Hyksos out of northern Egypt. After regaining his lost territory, the Egyptian pharaoh had no idea who these strange people were now living in Egypt's former territory. So Thutmose decided to enslave the Hebrews, but notice the reason he gave for doing this. We read, "Come, let us deal wisely with them, the Israelites, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from their land." The new king was very concerned that the Hebrews would join Egypt's enemy in the event of war. Who was this enemy that Pharaoh was so concerned about? And why was he concerned that the Hebrews would join them in a war against Egypt? Thutmose was undoubtedly talking about the Hyksos that he had just driven out of northern Egypt. And because of the similar culture, Thutmose was equally concerned that Israel would ally with the Hyksos if they ever retried to take Egypt. So this leads us to our final question. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Well, it was certainly not Thutmose, because several years would pass before Moses approached the Pharaoh asking for the release of the Hebrews. We are told that Moses was adopted into the family of the Pharaoh as an infant, where he grew up and later fled after killing an Egyptian guard, and then spent several years in the wilderness before he returned to Egypt to lead the Hebrews to the Promised Land. At this point, Moses was undoubtedly confronting Thutmose's son, Amenhotep, who reigned from 1524 BC to 1504 BC. And because we don't know how much time there was between the plagues, it's possible they maybe started in Thutmose's reign, but certainly finished in his son's. And there's one final detail about Amenhotep's reign that has an interesting biblical twist. In his article entitled Amenhotep, the Second King of Egypt's 18th Dynasty, author Jimmy Dunn writes, "Some information appears to indicate that Amenhotep's son died in infancy and that the pharaoh died childless. This confirms what the Bible says about the final plague, that the killing of the firstborn also touched the pharaoh's home." Despite the movies and documentaries portraying the pharaoh of the Exodus as Ramesses, I believe the biblical record, confirmed by archaeology, says it took place nearly 300 years earlier under Pharaoh Amenhotep. Thanks again for joining me on this podcast, and we'll catch you again.